Welcome to A Dram of Outlander. This is Desiree, your podcaster and the writer for ADramOfOutlander.com for all things Outlander, from the Dinah Gabaldon book series to the Starz TV series and everything in between. This is the Scottish Prisoner Read-Along, Week 1, Episode 69. Hello there! I'm so glad you could join me. We're going to do a little read-along here, and the Scottish Prisoner is considered part of the Lord John Grey series, but it gives so much background into Jamie's time while at Hellwater, into his relationship with Lord John as well, that I think it's really important to go through this book as a side note to Voyager. And it also opens up all the fun and the adult Hardy Boys style of the Lord John Grey series. And you know, we're sitting here in Droughtlander, and we have no idea when Season 3 is going to premiere. We gotta fill this time somehow, don't we, with more lovely Dinah Gabaldon words. So the timeline for this book is roughly 1760. And Claire comes along back in Jamie's life several years later. We're about midway through the Voyager tale at this time point. And we got some information about Jamie at Hellwater, say Geneva Dunsany, her death, the birth of William, how she blackmailed him, all of those things. But we really don't get a lot of information about Lord John. And I love how this ties everything together in a nice package. That's why I chose to do this book next. And since we don't know when Season 3 is going to premiere on television, I plan on spending roughly 11 weeks on this book. So at points it will be more summary, highlighting of key events and characters, and maybe not as detailed as the Voyager read-along. It's because there's 40 chapters and over 400 pages, and the over 900-page Voyager took 26 episodes. But I don't know if we really have time for 13 episodes here. But that could change. At the end of the podcast, I will give the rough outline of what the schedule looks like, but it's subject to change based on when the premiere is going to be for the Season 3 television show. So if it's in April, we will wrap up on April 15th, the day before the premiere episode, if my guesstimates would be correct. And if it doesn't air until summer, well, I will lengthen out the series a bit and then also do some podcasts on a novella or maybe some things from The Outlandish Companion, Volume 1. We'll have to figure out how that looks as we go along down the line because we really don't know. But I'm really excited to go through this book because if you don't like Lord John Grey yet, you will probably love him by the end of this book. And we also get to know his brother, his sister-in-law, and some more characters. To me, it's a fun adventure. And when I said the Lord John series is like an adult Hardy Boys, it really is. It's really full of mystery and adventure, and he's trying to figure things out. It's not so much the story of his life, even though that gets put in here, but it's more mystery and solving what's going on. I'm going to start with the prologue because I think it bears full mention, because it sets a foundation for this book. If you deal in death routinely, there are two paths. Either it becomes routine, in which case you risk killing for nothing and thus lose your soul. For if the lives you take are worth nothing, neither is yours. Or you become that much more aware of the value of a life and that much more reluctant to take one without the direst necessity. That way you risk losing your own life. There are the quick and there are the dead. I do not mean what St. Paul meant about that, but not your soul. Soldiers manage by dividing themselves. They're one man in the killing, another at home, and the man that dandles his bairn on his knee has nothing to do with the man who crushed his enemy's throat with his boot. So he tells himself, sometimes successfully. But it marks your killing, no matter why it's done. It's a brand upon your heart, and while it may heal, the mark cannot be removed, save by a blade. All you can hope for is a cleaner scar. I love that. To me, it's the duplicity of being a soldier, a warrior, the killer, and also being the lover, the father, the friend, the husband. This prologue is here for a reason. Let's not forget it as we go through 400 pages. I wonder, how does this shape Jamie's choices from here? Or perhaps how does it shape the choices of, say, Lord John Grey or his brother Hal? We'll have to see. Section 1, The Fate of Fuses. Chapter 1, April Fool. We're at Hellwater. It's in the Lake District, which is in the northwest region of England near the Scottish borders. Jamie is the Scottish prisoner, of course. He is a groom at Hellwater. He's been there since Ardsmuir closed and the other prisoners were sent to the colonies. He was too high profile to be let free or sent across the water. He lives out his parole here. Jamie sleeps in the barn with the other grooms. It's cold, so cold in fact he thinks his cock might just break off in his hand. He wakes from a dream and he's feeling the urgency of Claire about him. He needs to release. He has to have an orgasm. So he goes down into the barn, figuring the horses wouldn't care what he's doing. This makes me sad. There's no privacy to even relieve his even most basic sexual needs. Claire was vivid to him. He could even smell her. And, oh, there's the memory of her mouth. At this point, he's been 14 years without her. Only the one encounter with Mary McNabb in the cave, the night before, he could get himself turned in to the British so his family would get the bounty on his head. It's been 14 years, and he's had sex with no one else save that one night. Claire came to him in his dreams still, so real he could taste and smell her. And we learned in Voyager the same happens to her. I wonder if they communicated in their dreams, and it happened at the same time. With her still in his mind, yearning for her, he found a place of some privacy to relieve himself. And he collapses onto his knees and onto the ground. Lord, that she might be safe, was his last conscious thought, she and the child. He was asleep deeply until someone shook him by the shoulder. And as soon as he gathered his wits, he responds like a cat, up on his feet immediately. He wants to know who's there. It sounds like a woman. He reaches out and grabs her arm. She squeals, and he has to make up a story because it wakes the other grooms. It was Betty, one of the ladies' maids. He then takes her outside. She says she saw him coming out of the loft, and there's a man who wants to speak to him. He was uneasy with her seeing him come out of the loft. I mean, his hand was on his penis. She gives him the message from the Irishman. And Jamie wants nothing to do with this Irishman, or any Irishman, and says good night. And she reaches and touches him and strokes him down his back gently, just above his buttocks. And then she invites him into her bed, since his must be cold by now and hers is far warmer. She was close to him, and her hand now rested on his backside. He bids her good night, and as he looks back, he can see that her eyes are squinted like an angry cat. Betty had been Geneva Dunsany's maid until her death. Then she returned to Hellwater and became her sister's maid. And she'd given him the lusty eye when he first arrived 3 years before. He could avoid her mostly because maids and grooms don't have a lot in common. But he couldn't avoid Geneva, though. And as he thought of her, he said a prayer of repose. It was the least he could do. He does feel tremendous guilt over her death. And he was trying to figure out why Betty came looking for him at night. She hadn't spoken to him in 6 months. What was going on here? Did she mean to climb into the loft or sneak him into the servants' attic? He went over all the detail in his head. And then he discovers in his mind she hadn't been looking for him at all. She must have been there meeting someone else. And in fact, that someone else was likely in the vacant box Jamie had gone into to relieve himself. And he thinks she woke him up to allow that man to get out. This embarrassed him a little, and also roused his anger. And he thought surely he would notice somebody in the box, but in the state he was in, hungry for Claire, clinging to that dream, he never would have noticed someone else there. In this chapter, it's small, but we get a sense of his attitude. He was gruff with Betty. He still gets into this tremendous state of need for Claire all these years later, nearly a decade and a half. We see his living conditions. He's living in a hay loft, or a loft with hay in it, above the barn, with 2 other men. He's cold, so the conditions are not great. Grooms must be very low on the totem pole of servants. He goes by the name MacKenzie, and he's a month away from his 40th birthday when this chapter opens. So we're getting a picture of what this looks like, how he interacts with the other servants that we've met, where he's living, what it feels like. And poor Jamie, no privacy at all. Chapter 2, Heirs. We find ourselves in London at Arga's house, residence of Harold, Duke of Pardloe. That is Hal, Lord John Grey's older brother. And Hal is the one who refused to kill Jamie after Culloden because of John's promise. And John sits holding a tied-up stack of papers, and it was like a bomb in his hands. And Hal could see this on John's face and gives him a gimlet eye. And after he hands over the stack of papers, he couldn't stand watching Hal read through them, so he stood and went over to look out the library window, down into the garden. He ignored the pages turning and the occasional cursing that came from Hal. He sees Hal's boys playing outside in the garden. There were 3 of them. And Dottie, the young toddler, was being watched by the nurse, and she was feeding bits of bread to the goldfish in the pond. It was a rare, beautiful April day, and John wanted to be down there playing. He really wanted to be running naked in the water. The sun was warm and high through the window. He was thinking of someone named Siverly in an unflattering cartoon depiction. Then Hal swears in German. German was used for the most serious cussing, French for minor things, and Latin for written insults. Minnie, Hal's wife, refused to allow them to swear in English in the house because of the boys. Hal at this point is angry and on his feet. How dare he? He yells twice. This reassures John because Hal believes what's in those papers. He believes that Carruthers, who wrote them, is telling the truth. And Hal talks to John about knowing him, and Hal asks John if he believes it. John knew Carruthers in more ways than one, he was thinking. And yes, John believes it too. All the things that Carruthers put together against Siverly, who's in Canada. Carruthers made sure he put everything down on paper to see justice done before dying of ill health. Another paper written by Carruthers was indecipherable to them, hence the chapter title. Neither had seen anything like it, though. It looked like a real language because of the diacritical markings and the style in which it was written. It's not Greek, Hebrew, Russian, or Turkish. They couldn't figure out why Carruthers would write in another language, but it must pertain to Siverley somehow. Hal wants to know if Carruthers was a logical man. I love this part because we can start seeing them go through the critical thinking questions, and they're trying to create a picture of why something would be there that they don't expect. Gray thinks it over, and he thinks of how he knew Carruthers in the biblical sense. They knew each other well enough to leave all of this entrusted to him to handle. But no, John did not think Carruthers was altogether a logical man, but he was a determined man. He fought to get all of this together in spite of his ailing heart. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, he said. Suddenly John was filled with memories of their room in Quebec, the sights and smells, his friend's frailty. I hunger, John, and you thirst. You won't fail me. John asks Hal if there's enough evidence for a court-martial to occur. Hal thinks there's more than enough here. But looking at that mysterious page, he wonders aloud if it were a cipher or a code. He even held it close to the fire to see if any other words appeared when exposed to the heat. Nothing appeared. Now he just had a smoking page. John doesn't think Carruthers would go to that extent. He knew he was dying, and why would he try to hide this information from John, who he was trusting with it? Hal asks if it could be a mistake to be included. Everything else about the packet of papers was meticulous. Everything was done with great care, precision, and passion. And they go through some more analysis. Yes, it's in Carruthers' own hand. It looks like verse. There are repetitions. Maybe Carruthers had discovered it in Siverley's papers but couldn't decode it. They were brainstorming everything that this could be. They're troubleshooting this scenario. John wants to know how Hal knows so much about ciphers and secret writing. Minnie, Hal says. Minnie is Hal's secret weapon. Her father was Raphael Wadaswade. John never heard of him, but nor was he meant to. He was a rare book dealer and an intelligence dealer, a spy master without sons. Tell me that your father did not employ her as a spy. He did, the scrofulous old bugger. That's exactly how Hal and Minnie met. I gather you did not immediately have her arrested and taken before a magistrate? No, I had her on the hearthrug. John almost drops the cherry decanter in his hands, hearing this. And I think, oh, brothers. Hal is giving him some shocking information. And then John finds himself wondering if Minnie was a virgin when it happened. But he didn't ask. Then I put her into a coach, made her tell me her address, and said I would call on her in the morning to ask after her welfare. And now he gives John some sherry to drink. John drinks it. And John was also trying not to look at the hearthrug. Can you imagine? It's like knowing somebody had sex in their kitchen. Every time you're in their kitchen, you're kind of thinking, where? Was it on that counter? Was it on the table? Was it on that counter? On the floor? Had they mopped first? I find it hilarious as humans that we can be involved in all sorts of sexual things, but the minute we think somebody else is, we're stunned by it. We're all clutching at our pearl necklaces. The rug, it was very old and quite beat up. And John thinks it was given to Hal as a wedding gift from his first wife, Esme. No, of course Minnie didn't tell him her real address, and it took him 6 months to find her. I think Hal fell in love with her that very first day. And he decides he's going to take the page to her to see if she can tell if it's encoded or not. John drinks more sherry and looks out over the now quiet garden. Dottie and her nurse were both napping in the grass. The nurse's hand was still firmly gripped on Dottie's gown. And John was thinking. He wasn't sure if he was shocked or not by his brother's story. Hal did what he wanted. He made up his own rules. And at this point, Minerva Waterswade had the upper hand on Hal, and Hal knew it. There's a crash from above, and he wonders how old Benjamin is now. And he begins to think about receiving the news of Benjamin's birth and how it brightened spirits after he lost 3 men the day before. It was good news not only for John, but for Hal too. Hal had lost his first wife in childbirth along with the baby. And she had also been seduced by one of Hal's friends, Nathaniel Twelvetrees. And Hal had killed him in a duel. And John wonders how long after that did he meet Minnie. And as he's looking out of the window, he briefly sees Minnie, and Hal follows her with the paper in hand. And then he realizes he was startled by Hal's story, but not because of the content, but because of how secretive Hal is. He doesn't divulge very much. He would only confide in 3 people: John, Harry Corey, who was the governor of Ardsmuir before John, and Minnie. So what was going on? Maybe something with Minnie? John couldn't figure out why Hal was so freely giving information. And then it begins to rain. Dottie and her nurse were awoken by drops on them, and the nurse wants to dash into the house, but Dottie is delighting in the drops. John leans out the window and smiles because of how it feels and how it smells, and he closes his eyes. Hal comes back in and catches him enjoying the moment and wants to know what he's doing. He's enjoying the rain. John wants to know if Minnie helped, and she did, but it wasn't a code. We find out that the language is Airsa. It's Gaelic from the Scottish Highlands. And John was surprised because it's such a barbaric language that it's in the written form, too. John, you're being an assumptive and classist ass. Seriously. Oh, those Highlanders couldn't possibly have a written language. And I will tell you, that was one of the toughest things to see going to Scotland, that when you look at everything from the Jacobite uprising, Culloden, on how lesser the Scots are depicted compared to the English. Looking through their military history after that, when the Scots were part of the British Army, they were treated as secondary and that they were disposable. It's quite alarming to still see threads of that. The Scottish people are lovely, warm, kind, and highly apologetic people. But I was stunned to see that sort of second-class citizen in comparison to the English still existing today. And everybody might not see that. I'm highly sensitive to things like that. So to me, it really stood out. But to others, they might not notice at all. And Hal asked John if he'd ever heard it at Ardsmuir. He did, but he absolutely did not like thinking about that time. He was in exile while he was there. Did Fraser speak it? Oh God, not that. Anything but that, Cray thought. Yes, he replied. Hal wants to know when John saw Fraser last. Oh, it's been more than a year. And he wants John to go to Hellwater to speak to Jamie about Siverley. to translate the letter. John says no. No? Hal says. I would not piss on him was he burning in the flames of hell, John replies. Hal raises his eyebrows for a moment. Just so. The question, though, is whether Fraser might be inclined to perform a similar service for you. Only if you thought I might drown. And with that, John left. So something had happened between John and Jamie at their last meeting, and this has left John a bit cold. So what have we seen in these first 2 chapters? And I know this initial podcast is a bit short. I was trying to figure out the tempo of things. And we'll get more condensed from here. We see what the relationship between John and Hal is like. It's trusted. It can be candid. They banter. John reminds us that he's indeed gay when he talks about knowing Carruthers biblically. Because perhaps people forgot about that from Voyager, or if they had never read Voyager, now they would know. Why do we need to know that? Because if you read the Lord John Gray series, it talks about that part of his life. And we need to understand him and how he views Jamie and how that colors the relationship that they have. Minnie is a mother of 4, a wife, and a prior spy. She's a many-layered thing, this one. There's the military matter of Syverley to contend with, and John must go to talk with Jamie at Hellwater. I think it will get very interesting from here. And something I thought would be really fun during the read-along would be to look at some of the words or phrases of the chapters we're covering. We all know Diana Gabaldon has an immense vocabulary, and sometimes we have to look things up when we read. So what did I pull out of these 2 chapters? Somnolence, which means very sleepy. Gimlet eye, which is a piercing stare. Remember, Hal gave John a gimlet eye. Defalcations, which means misappropriation of monies. Speaking of Syverley. And my favorite was scrofulous, which means morally contaminated or corrupt. And that is what Hal called Minnie's father. A scrofulous bugger. I think it would be great if some of you, as many of you as wanted, would use any of these terms in a sentence and put it on one of the A Dram of Outlander social media pages of your choice. I think that could be something to look forward to every week. The schedule is going to be very tight if we find out that Season 3 premieres in April. If we get a premiere date that's further out, I will reconfigure the schedule to fit better. Next week, we're going to be doing 4 chapters, 3, 4, 5, and 6. They're not all very long, and as you can see by the tempo of how this is written, it's not like Voyager, where it's super detailed everywhere. 2 chapters in Voyager would generally get me an hour and 10 of podcast, and this is probably 25 minutes. And that's all right. So this is just the beginning. It's our little introduction. This will be fun and furious and wild, and we're going to get to see some different storytelling. It is a departure from Outlander, and if you haven't gone through the Lord John series yet, some of this will surprise you greatly because we get into that groove of the Outlander series specifically, and many of the novellas have that same feel to them. They're not distinctly different, but the Lord John Gray series is distinctly different, and I love him. I wish he could be my friend. So remember, you can find A Dram of Outlander on Facebook, On Twitter and Instagram, it's Dram of Outlander. The email, please send me your feedback, is adramofoutlander@gmail.com. The website, of course, is adramofoutlander.com. And the call-in line is 719-425-9444. Please call in with your questions, suggestions, thoughts, and I will put them on the show. And if you like the show, please share it with your friends. Share the links that I post, send them to the website, send them to the podcast. And if you're on iTunes, please, 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 I ask you to post a review of the show. It helps people more easily find me. And it's also on Stitcher and Google Play. So I loved this short, sweet introduction, and we're going to have a great time. And remember, Wednesday nights on Twitter at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern Time. And we use the hashtag ADOO, Adram of Outlander, so everyone can see the tweets. Have a great week, everybody. And until next time, Slán Java.